Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you very much for joining us for our first talk of 2022, generously delivered by Dr. Peter Purton, who I'm sure many of you are familiar with due to his work with the group, and of course, his research on medieval sieges, and especially to do with the gunpowder age as well. And Peter's talk today is about bombards and battlements, the late medieval castle in the gunpowder age. So, a fascinating subject. Peter, over to you.
Thank you very much, Richard. Good evening, everyone. And I'm delighted to be offering this first CSG lecture of the 2022 season. The artist who added this image in two versions to manuscripts prepared by Royal Clerk Walter de Malemete for the education of young King Edward III as he began his reign in 1327, couldn't know the status it would later acquire. Some have doubted its authenticity, but the overwhelming majority of scholarly opinion agrees that this is the first representation of a gun in Europe. There's also general agreement that gunpowder itself had first been made in China, where for a long time it was a pyrotechnic. Then, during the Song dynasty from 960 AD, was modified for use as a handheld weapon in the form of a fire lance. It is also largely accepted that the first weapons where gunpowder, with a different formula, was used as a propellant, that is, guns, also happened in China, towards the end of the 13th century, reaching Europe within a few decades, where the earliest surviving documentary reference is from Florence in 1326. My subject tonight has two strands. The first is, what was the impact of the new technology on castles? Many historians have argued that this heralded a gunpowder revolution with far-reaching political, economic, and social consequences, contributing to the transformation of medieval society into more recognizably early modern states in the 16th century. These big questions are beyond my scope today, except to suggest that it would be strange if the new technology did not also impact on the castles of the ruling classes, metaphorically and literally. Now, the arrows shot from this gun, the Malemete gun, would do little harm to a 14th century castle. But the threat was bigger by the 1370s. There were several periods that saw an increase in the size and impact of medieval guns. Contrast these from a little over a century later. Monsmeg in Edinburgh, de la Huit in Ghent, and a bombard in Istanbul, used in the capture of Constantinople in 1453. Yes, they're status symbols, but all of these weapons also saw military action. Surely this is a topic that's been done to death. We've long been re-educated out of military interpretations, and we all accept that the castle architecture of the 14th and 15th centuries continued this tradition of serving as a statement and symbol of power, of visual representation of aristocratic and royal status, and of providing residences, combining these features with the comforts expected by the rich and powerful. In the excellent talk by James Wright last April on Tattershall, the ways in which this magnificent castle ticked all these boxes were set out most convincingly. The obviously only symbolic defensive features spell out the intentions and expectations of the owner, Ralph Cromwell, Henry VI's treasurer. If we compare Tattershall from the 1440s with Kirby Muxloe, started by William Hastings in 1480, a loyal servant of Henry's enemy and killer Edward IV, the gatehouse and the walls that were completed before Hastings lost his head to Richard III are by contrast provided with numerous gun loops. A different purpose here then? No. The loops have no field of fire and some are dummies. And this was not a mistake. In this case, everyone has concluded that they were symbolic, something that a rising nobleman expected to have to show that he truly belonged to an aristocracy that still prided itself on its military prowess, that still led armies into battle, and in death liked to be portrayed in a suits of armor. My second strand, therefore, is to explore where, when, and why such representations of defence were only symbolic, or whether they were motivated by genuine defensive purpose, and to review wider questions of context that might help us towards alternative explanations, and to look at some examples of castles in which genuinely defensive works were combined with magnificent aristocratic statement architecture. But, spoiler alert, ultimately these questions can only be matters of interpretation. It is almost always impossible to recover what was in the mind of the castle builder, although I hope to show we can make a good guess. The impact of gunpowder on medieval fortification is the subject of my next book, which I'm co-writing with Dr. Christoph Krauskopf, who works for the Heritage Authority in Brandenburg in Germany. I hope he's been able to join us tonight. Our planned field trips having been torpedoed by COVID, an enforced 2 years of only reading has reinforced that this is an enormous project. Much of the validity of any interpretation is in the detail, particularly accurate dating, the most obvious but not the only issue. It's hard to keep up with the latest scholarship on hundreds of sites, so many thanks to those of you who have already helped us. We have to retrace our steps by nearly a century, from Tattershall splendours to much more modest architecture. And I've lost my pointer here. Excuse me a moment, folks. Here we go. To observe the first well-dated evidence of adaptations to buildings to allow for defence by the small guns of that time. Thanks to Derek Wren, we know that these crude gun holes were pierced in the walls of Carr Abbey on the Isle of Wight between 1365 and the end of that decade. Indeed, not a castle, but one would struggle to argue that these holes were symbols of anything. But with the possible exception of an impossible to date loop in St. Stephen's Gate in Norwich's city walls, and some now rejected examples in the wall of the Abbey of Saint-Marc-des-Fossés near Paris, these are the first. This is also the first example where the context is critical to the interpretation. At this date, everyone knows, while English soldiers had spent decades ravaging the towns, villages and countryside of much of France, either at royal orders or operating as independent companies of bandits when the king disbanded his armies, the only way of hitting back available to the victims was by seaborne raids on the long coast of southern England, a form of attack quite impossible for medieval navies to prevent. There's much contemporary evidence. With galleys using sails or oars, raiders could select their targets, land their soldiers almost anywhere, burn property or crops, seize goods, capture anyone worth ransoming, and return to their ships before they could be intercepted by the militia assembled by local knights and gentry. A vivid account by Gutierre Díaz de Gamez in his Life of Pedro Niño, Count of Buelna, reports a Franco-Castilian campaign in 1404. It began with burning ships and the houses at St. Ives, then proceeded to Dartmouth, where they were driven off by the, quote, bolts and the bombards shot from the town, perhaps Hawley's fortalice. And they steered clear of Plymouth because of the fortifications. On the Isle of Portland, they fought a battle with the local militia and concluded on the Isle of Wight, where they were scared off by a rapid assembly of local people with longbows. I offer this evidence because the proposition that taking steps to protect the country against such attacks has anything to do with castle building has not always been taken as seriously as I believe it deserves. Both the local community and their leaders, the knights of the area, and the central government took the threat very seriously indeed. Even more so, on the several occasions it was known that armies were gathered in French ports, awaiting shipping to transport them across the Channel. It was both a question of the losses that could be incurred. 50% of Southampton was burnt in the raid of 1338, and of a king needing to fulfill his primary role of defending his kingdom. They didn't enjoy the benefit of our hindsight to know that no such invasion actually occurred. Edward III's reaction was prompt and vigorous in 1338, calling for maintaining the watch from church towers, lighting beacons, arraying local men to resist. They were exempt from serving the king overseas for this reason. Such measures were called upon again and again over the coming decades, routinely confirmed in the close and patent rolls. It would be astonishing if among the defensive measures ordered by the government were not steps to maintain or strengthen local fortifications. By the 1360s, these steps included making provision to use guns in defence. You'll be familiar with the following examples, but I make no apology for revisiting these places because among many architectural features they have in common was an interest in using guns for defence and an interest by the king in the process. Cooling Castle in Kent was built by John de Cobham, whose family had long held a manor here from 1380. From 1380, the castle. The year before, French and Castilian ships had raided up the River Thames, pillaged the coast where Cooling stands. It was then closer to the sea than it is today, and penetrated as far as Gravesend. The king had already instructed his favourite master builder, Henry Yeveley, to assist and probably to design the famous West Gate of Canterbury and to begin the upgrading of the city walls, both of which were provided copiously with gun loops. Those of the West Gate demonstrating a particularly clever layout across 2 stories to enable a wide field of fire, as Derek Wren pointed out. Yeveley was also involved in the design of Cooling. Now, Cobham, a member of the King's Council, would undoubtedly have been keen to mark his status by moving upmarket from a mere manor to a castle. At the same time, the design hints at a more utilitarian purpose as well. The large outer ward would provide refuge for local people. The gun loops in the outer and inner gatehouses enabled use of modern weapons, or at least their presence might deter would-be attackers looking for easy prey. Cooling has a remarkable plaque, which appears to be original. Whether the message is a genuine reflection of Cobham's motivation or was an example of 14th century political spin is something we cannot know. But we can't rule it out either. Yeveley spent time at Cooling over several years. He also devoted attention to Archbishop Courtenay's castle at Saltwood, which we visited some years ago, where the gatehouse, which is similar to Canterbury West Gate, was built during the same decade with loops for guns. However, the numerous loops in the gatehouse at Hever, in the same county, but much further inland, the earliest of which also date from the 1380s, make a strong case for the alternative explanation, wanting to appear modern and military, but in a building that was seriously indefensible, even though it also belonged to the Cobhams. The Crown at this time was manufacturing or buying gunpowder weapons and the components to make gunpowder, and the ammunition, gun arrows and balls of stone or lead. This is all documented, as is the dispatch of guns to Dover and Carisbrooke castles, and to brand new Queenborough on the Isle of Sheppey during the invasion scare of 1377, where of course we can no longer identify whether the design included structures for their deployment. But we can at the new tower built by the Constable, Sir Robert Ashton, at Porchester from 1376 to 1381, which provided both comfortable accommodation and provision for defence by gun. The shooting gallery around the north and east sides of the tower at Wall Walk level, which is behind the loops you can see in the slide, is not connected to the interior and represents an early example of such design. It's reconstructed in Cunliffe and Munby's 1985 research report. Now, this was the time when castle builders were exploiting the possibilities of new late Gothic, or in this country, perpendicular architectural styles to produce the magnificent examples with which we're familiar today. A list of some of the most spectacular surviving examples of structures built by rulers at great expense in the middle of the 14th century would include Windsor, Vincennes, the Papal Palace at Avignon, Emperor Charles IV's Karstein, Marienburg, Malbork of the Teutonic Knights, and Pedro I's palace built into the earlier and once Muslim Alcazar of Seville. They tick the same boxes as the much later Tattershall, although on a greater scale. This was majesty, whether secular or in religious clothing, represented in stone, soaring architecture outside and in, towering but delicate vaults, windows, doors, fireplaces to match, exquisite sculptures, everything the 14th century ruler wanted to show off. And, in time-honoured tradition, less elevated lords sought to emulate their social superiors. However, many of these buildings also demonstrated awareness of gunpowder weapons. It's possible to address the question of context again. Not to propose that there must be a direct link between external events and the ruler's thought processes, which is impossible to prove, but to suggest how the real world as it appeared at the time may have influenced decisions on building. Let's consider the royal palace of Charles V at Vincennes, now in the far eastern suburbs of Paris. There is perfection of proportion in its geometric plan, complexities of its design across an immense site. Towering above it all is the donjon I show here, erected as a vertical royal palace, 52 meters high, 6 stories, interiors still suggesting the late Gothic splendor with which they were furnished. While it was being completed between 1372 and 1380, the kingdom was again at war with England, and for the ruling class, the memories of the peasant uprisings, the Jacquerie, and the insurrections of the people of Paris were recent and real. John of Gaunt had led a chevauchée all the way from Calais to Bordeaux, circling Paris to the east in 1373. There was fighting in Normandy throughout the decade. In 1380, the Earl of Buckingham emulated Gaunt and devastated a strip of country between Calais and Brest, again passing around the city to the east. A challenging environment. It would be a surprise if a king determined that his new palace should emphasize his majesty, did not also ensure that it could be defended. And provision was made for the most modern weapons available, handguns. Accounts confirm that there were canonniers in 1379, alongside traditional crossbowmen in the garrison. The outworks one can see today are a reconstruction of the 19th century, but there had been a barbican in front of the access. Defence was on the upper 2 floors, originally planned as a single floor. Without chimneys or comforts, it has 8 openings across the 4 sides, 2.4 meters wide inside in arched niches. There are holes in the middle of each side wall for a bar on which to rest a gun. And in the turrets are slits that have been widened to enable guns to shoot horizontally and downwards. Nicolas Faucher, whose study I have used, says these were contemporary with the construction, making them amongst the earliest to be found in France. Sadly, there was no access to the upper floors when I visited it. Turning the uppermost levels of grand accommodation into defensive platforms was not new, but these builders knew what was needed to engineer the space for the use of people shooting gunpowder weapons. The top levels of the Caesar and Guy's Tower at Warwick date from slightly earlier than Vincennes and follow a remarkably similar pattern. These are at the top of Guy's Tower, and Caesar's Tower, to which there is no access, is similar. Now, to reiterate, this is not to reject 4 decades of the new orthodoxy of castle studies. It's not evident that Earl Thomas Beauchamp of Warwick, enriched by war, was afraid either of foreign invasion or of revolting locals. He was celebrating military success, but probably not expecting war to arrive in his lands. His new building was primarily designed for lavish accommodation, so perhaps these spaces for guns were only for display. Indeed, not far from Warwick, there stand other splendid dwellings from the same period, such as Maxstoke, with no pretensions to defensibility, let alone defensive purpose, although it was built by a military figure, the Earl of Huntingdon, or of course John of Gaunt's Newhall at Kenilworth. Placing these contemporaries together suggests sometimes interpretation is easy, but sometimes, as at Warwick, where the same debate applies to the unfinished Bear Tower of the 1480s, the question of purpose cannot be answered so easily. We've seen that ways to adapt buildings to accommodate the gun for use in defence didn't take long to cross the Channel. However, gun loops were a little slower to cross the Rhine. Context again both supplies possible explanation and questions. Among the numerous conflicts between rulers of the many states and independent cities and bishoprics within the Holy Roman Empire, the expansionary activities of Hermann II, Landgrave of Hesse from 1376 to 1413, were resisted by his neighbours. His castles raised similar questions as to form and function. Please remember, by the way, the location of Tannenberg. A war was fought between 1373 and 1375, during which time Hermann had built a large residential tower, Hermannstein, above the town of Wetzlar, occupied by one of his enemies. Now, it certainly appears that this tower served a largely symbolic purpose, having no evident military elements, or at least none that have survived. But 30 years later, his son, Ludwig I, built a castle called Ludwigstein. His family was clearly not modest. 2 other castles also bear his name. On the border, and facing directly that of his enemy, the Lord of Hanstein. Dated by accounts to 1415-16, there were keyhole gun loops in the upper story of the tower. Leaving aside questions about the dating, these would be the first gun loops in German-speaking lands, there are also doubts about whether they could work, as is seen in the drawing. There's a grotesque head carved into Ludwigstein, staring at Hanstein Castle, sending a clear symbolic message. But the question of the practical viability of the loops here is echoed in not a few other sites. But another possible explanation is that this was the first time the master mason had been asked to create such things, and quite simply didn't know what to do. I'm sure we've all had that experience with builders. We must now examine the continuing evolution of the gun and its consequences. Over these first decades, the examples shown have adapted traditional loops for guns as defensive weapons. Those attacking fortresses had also made widespread use of guns, but not as wall breakers. For this, the traditional attack by trebuchet and, where feasible, undermining remained the norm. However, this was changing. Over the course of several decades, either side of the turn of the 15th century, improved manufacturing techniques made possible the creation of much larger and more potent guns, while modifications in the making of gunpowder increased velocity, accuracy, and ballistic force. It was not long before these impacts were felt in the real world. The French siege of Saint-Sauveur-le-Vicomte in Normandy in 1374 can be reconstructed both from Froissart's account and from French records, telling of dramatic damage done to the stone walls and towers by guns. The records detail the manufacture and assembly of larger guns. The largest weighed 2,300 pounds, more than a ton, 1,035 kilograms in new money. Not yet enormous, but a substantial increase on size of what was common. The remains were reconstructed afterwards, and anyway, the greatest damage was to the now disappeared outer ward. So you can't see much on the photo, I fear. 4 years later, chroniclers noted the devastating impact of guns made for Venice at Treviso during the War of Chioggia, the conflict with Genoa that began the expansion of the Venetian Empire. Investing in the substantial costs of large new bombards, few of which sadly survive, became common, and wealthy independent cities were among the best customers. Frankfurt am Main had built an enormous gun that was deployed at the cost of much labour against the robber knights occupying the castle of Tannenberg, refer you back to the map, in 1399. Excavation recovered both the 400-kilogram stone balls of the attacker's gun and the handguns used by the occupants. The gun was becoming a standard weapon for the attacker as well as the defender, and its presence is attested time and again in records of many conflicts over these decades, perhaps the most familiar to this audience being King Henry V's rapid conquest of Normandy in 1417-19 after his victory at Agincourt, where gunpowder artillery becomes prominent amongst the king's preparations. In response, we see significant changes to defences for the first time, but not a single set of steps, because it was still rare for the gun to be decisive. Saint-Sauveur-le-Vicomte was badly damaged by guns, but the siege ended when the French paid the English garrison to leave. In 1398, and again in 1410, the Aragonese defenders of the papal palace at Avignon resisted for a long time the attempts of the local population and French armies to oust schismatic Pope Benedict XIII, despite them borrowing a large gun from Aix-en-Provence that required 36 horses to move it, and manufacturing a similar monster of their own, which blew up. The palace surrendered each time after long blockades. Built under two popes, the old and the new palace, particularly richly decorative inside, together still represented a formidable fortress on the outside, and here were used as such. In 1417, guns played an important part for Henry V, but they were rarely decisive on their own. The impact of the Frankfurt gun at Tannenberg in demolishing a whole stretch of the castle wall was decisive, but in 1399 this was still rare. During the repeated crusades launched by Pope and Emperor Sigismund against the Hussites in Bohemia in the 1420s, handguns played an important role among the tactics used by the rebels in defeating the invasions, but had little effect in the many sieges that also took place. But the new artillery of these years did impact on castle building. During a war, there was no time for building anew in stone, and records tell us that earth and timber was used to erect bulwarks in front of gates. If properly constructed, this had the additional benefit that earth might better absorb the impact of a stone ball. The addition of outer defences to shield the tall, visually powerful inner walls became a measure widely adopted during the 15th century, and the construction in stone of barbicans, or boulevards, no doubt served multiple roles, but the defensive role of protecting a vulnerable part of the castle or town and providing a platform for the defender's guns, helping to keep an attacker at a greater distance, was vital. This example is at Caen, added to the defences of a large outer ward from the first half of the 15th century, along with strong towers with loops and a talus, while also featuring a formidable ditch. All of these being defensive measures fit for the contemporary world. Given Caen's recent history, it would be hard to deny a defensive purpose for this work. And similarly, at another fine example, this time in brick, the so-called Plauen bulwark built by the Teutonic Knights at Malbork in the 1420s. After the successful defence of the castle against the Polish-Lithuanian siege following their victory at Grunwald in 1410. This formidable defence was modern and practical, but it also poses another relevant, wider question. Why the Teutonic Knights had not otherwise adapted their great network of castles for guns before this? They were using gunpowder weapons during the 14th century in attacks on Lithuanian cities, and from 1400, they were also manufacturing them at Malbork. Yet prior to this bulwark, the only suggestion of incorporating gun loops in their castles is at the new castle of Botolph from around 1400. These convent castles and their subordinate fortified buildings served clearly defined functions. But at a time when they were regularly called upon to participate in warfare, one might have expected a quicker response to new technology. It would come in the end, but took several decades. Perhaps it was simply conservatism. Castle builders saw no need to change traditional designs because, well, in some cases, they weren't motivated by defensive needs at all. In others, maybe, they didn't know the best solutions, or other factors, geography, cost, wishes of the patron, absence of skilled craftsmen, prevented them. It's little known that the great Italian architect Brunelleschi, famed for the dome of the Cathedral of Florence, devoted much of his time to modernizing or building castles and city defenses, both for Florence and its enemies, during the 1420s and 1430s. His castle of Vico Pisano in Tuscany, which was begun in 1436, has, as you can see, a small quadrangular ward within tall machicolated walls, with a 6-story great tower in one corner. The walls are not exceptionally thick, but do have gun loops at ground level. In some, nothing new here at all. An effort to incorporate guns into the defence, but no reflection of the danger that guns outside might blast through this imposing but vulnerable curtain. Vico Pisano is a near contemporary of Tattershall and shares the design characteristic of emphasising power through verticality, ignoring the negative impact on defensibility. Although Brunelleschi was probably seeking to combine this element with the symbolic aspects in a way in which Cromwell's builders showed no interest. Other castles built or modernised in Italy between the mid-14th and mid-15th centuries may have demonstrated similar approaches to Brunelleschi, but it can now be difficult to see. There are numerous castles across the Papal States, now forming the regions of Lazio, Umbria, Marche, and Emilia-Romagna. And many of these are known from documentary evidence to have undergone substantial modernisation under the direction of the militaristic Spanish Cardinal Albornoz, sent by the popes during the 1350s to recover possession of the many castles that had fallen into the hands of local families during the papal absence in Avignon. The great majority were subsequently rebuilt again, much strengthened in the second half of the 15th century. I haven't been able to visit them yet, so you'll have to wait for the book, except to show how new ideas of defence were adopted by their holinesses in their home castle in Rome, the Castel Sant'Angelo, from the mid-15th century onwards, with 3 circular low-lying bastions later wrapped in these octagons in 1495, and a new lower outer curtain wall. You may deduce that the popes were not always on good terms with the other residents of the centre of Christendom, and history told them they were wise to take precautions. Alongside deeper ditches, barbicans or ravelins, and strongly projecting flanking towers, another major development was the growing use of gun towers. The God's House Tower on Southampton city walls was probably built in 1417. This was another step in adapting tradition to new times. The primary purpose of such towers was not residential, although this space housed the city's gunner. But it was to mount guns that would enable the defenders to flank the walls and ditches on the same principle that had once been used by archers or crossbowmen. One had to store the powder and the ammunition, to have the space to work the guns, to have an effective field of fire, and to allow for the escape of the noxious fumes that guns produced. This was one line of development pursued across Europe, the Middle East, and India, but largely not reflected in England. Gun towers got larger and taller and thicker walled, strengthening the ability of a tower to resist attack by guns, but creating additional problems for their design to simultaneously ensure a field of fire and to evacuate smoke. The simplest approach was to add such a tower to an existing castle. This is what the master of the Livonian Order, the northern branch of the Teutonic Knights, did at the headquarters castle at Cesis, called Venden by the Knights, in Latvia. Increasingly, and continuing well into the 16th century, when the order was facing Russian invasion in Livonia, new gun towers were added at two opposite corners of quadrangular castles, a cheap way of ensuring 100% flanking coverage. The knights retained all the standard features of their castles, as might be expected in a conservative and indeed increasingly sclerotic hangover from the days of the Crusades. Now all their opponents were also Christians. But sometimes something different was required, as is evident in the castle of Bauska in the south of the country, close to the porous frontier across which raids back and forth into Lithuania were regular events. In the 16th century, a new castle was built onto the landward end of the promontory, on which Bauska, between two rivers where Bauska stands, protected by large earthworks that in part remain, but the original, started in 1465, remains standing. The South Gate Tower you can see in the first slide, much larger than its northern counterpart, contained high-quality vaulted chambers for the castle commander, but also embrasures for cannon. Similar embrasures offer all-round protection for the castle, its shape determined by the geography, and there is a quadrangular gun tower looking out over the river on the south, the bottom right slide. Gun towers appeared everywhere during the second half of the century, on town walls as well as castles. The next examples were also built anew, and therefore reflect what the ruler wanted rather than being constrained by existing walls. And they were sited within towns. When in 1477, Charles, Duke of Burgundy, tempted his nickname of the Rash once too often, Louis XI, King of France, swiftly seized the Duke's land in France and, anticipating the hostility of people in Burgundy to his rule, proceeded to protect it with 3 brand new castles. Local antipathy to the vast citadel in the ducal capital of Dijon had to wait for the French Revolution before it achieved its longed-for destruction. But one of the new fortresses survived better. At Ozon, on the then eastern frontier. The fortress is pentagonal, built into a corner of the existing city wall, equally menacing to the city itself and to the outside. What can no longer be seen are the wet moats originally fed from the river, and the ravelin built in front of the otherwise modest gate. There were originally 4 large gun embrasures around this tower at ground floor level, and 2 at first floor. There's an embrasure in the then latest form known as à la française, that is, X-shaped, wide inside for the gunners and outside to offer a wide field of fire, but narrow in the middle to protect the operators. The tower's plan eliminated dead ground. The Tour Notre Dame is 16 meters high, has a diameter of 19 meters, and the walls are 5 meters thick. The tower on the opposite side, the Tour des Moulins, has the same dimensions. Faucher's detailed 1994 analysis of all the royal citadels has now been published and explores a developing programme of such gun towers at fortresses held by the crown on all the frontiers of Louis's realm, further developed under the rule of his son Charles VIII, whose devastating invasion of Italy in 1494 was to be responsible for much further development of defensive building in castles and cities across that peninsula. Ozon is definitely about projecting power of authority, but it's also about being able to defend that power should it be challenged from outside or inside, both of which were real threats when it was built. It was during the second half of the 15th century, in a process accelerating towards the end of the century, that much experimentation can be observed in the many variations of design in castles built, rebuilt, or extended at that time. There are several angles from which to observe these changes. One is technological. Another big leap forward in the destructive power of gunpowder weapons was driven by further improvements in their manufacture and design, and the growing use of iron instead of stone cannonballs, the higher density allowing greater impact with smaller shot, accompanied by other benefits of reducing the dimensions of the guns. Another is organizational. Growing professionalization of armies in the wealthiest states, creating permanent artillery trains, in France, in Burgundy, in Iberia, in the larger Italian states such as Venice or Naples, and in the Ottoman Empire. A third is social. To resist these weapons, defences had to become both cleverer and stronger, and the increasing burden of cost, combined with the speed at which defences could become obsolete, speed measured in 15th rather than 21st century terms, meant many nobles who had once competed to combine luxury with defensibility had to abandon military pretensions altogether. This led to accelerating differentiation between castles being built or adapted to be militarily modern, and those where the owners instead built castles that, like Kirby Muxloe, presented a military face because it was expected, but with neither capability nor intention of ever being put to the test. Context again may help resolve where there is doubt about a builder's motivation. Among the drivers of continuing experiment were Italian condottieri, whose wealth derived from selling their military muscle and expertise, and those who reached the top ploughed their riches into commissioning works of art, but also increasingly sophisticated fortresses designed by a new generation of Renaissance architects to protect the city-states they had acquired by fair means or, more often, foul. Il Francione and his disciples Francesco di Giorgio Martini and the Sangallo family being foremost among many who have left their legacy across the peninsula. But it was Baccio Pontelli who designed the new papal castle at Ostia, built from 1486. Another experimental design, this based around a triangular plan and polygonal and one round towers, integrating gun embrasures and a circulation gallery inside. Add in the ditches, which are now gone, thick walls, high scarp and cordons, and ravelins, and you have the ingredients of the late 15th century castle, designed for effective defence as well as comfortable residence. In this case, the threat came from Ottoman Turks raiding the coasts of Italy, who supplied the context for many of the new defences, particularly in the Kingdom of Naples, where many of the glories of an earlier age, the castle palaces of Frederick II of the first half of the 13th century, were encased in powerful stone outworks designed to mount and to resist the impact of guns more than 250 years later. This is Bari in Puglia, where the outer defences date from the early 16th century. One thing has become clear, however, from studying many of the castles built or rebuilt over this period. There is no straight line heading inevitably from noble palaces doubling up as fortresses to the geometric, pentagonal, low-lying bastioned enceinte surrounding the towns and forests built for the rulers of early modern states, particularly those of the French monarchy, the Habsburg, Ottoman or Russian empires, or republics ranging in scale from Venice to Ragusa, Dubrovnik, many of which themselves demonstrate continuous experimentation with different ideas. There isn't time to explore the many byways that were attempted during this period. So I'll focus on a few examples where it's possible to argue a continued emphasis on combining residential comfort, powerful symbolism, and strong defense against gunpowder weaponry. Castile in the 15th century bears comparisons with contemporary England during the Wars of the Roses. Civil wars, succession crises, foreign interventions, here from Portugal and Aragon. The country was dominated by dynasties of noble families, holding vast tracts of country and towns, controlling bishoprics and crusader knightly orders, each with a private army, who spent much of their fortune building new statements of their power, but also, here differing perhaps from England, using their castles to defend that power. This castle, north of Madrid, is Manzanares el Real. It was built for the powerful Mendoza clan by the architect Juan Guas, who also built cathedrals, and the castles at Belmonte, seat of one of the Mendoza's rivals, Juan Pacheco, Marquis of Villena, the greediest and most treacherous of them all, and Montbeltran for the Duke of Albuquerque, which closely resembles Manzanares. Now, here at Manzanares, observe the outer defences. The English pioneer of modern studies of Spanish late medieval castles, Edward Cooper, dates the inner castle to 1476 on documentary evidence, abandoning an older castle on the other side of the river Manzanares and incorporating the apse of an existing church. The quadrangular interior, closed to one of several restorations when I visited in 1976, had a colonnaded patio. There was an elegant Torre del Homenaje, Spanish donjon, in one corner, and the exterior of the walls and towers displays a spectacular gallery. A little later, the outer wall was erected. This is a barrera, an artillery barrier equivalent to the French fauspray or the German Zwinger, liberally provided with gun loops. This example stands at one end of this spectrum, a long way from a fortress, but planned to dissuade a rival from plundering the wealth inside, perhaps. Manzanares, whose Disney fantasy appearance has been deliberately cultivated in its modern restoration, but in a way that probably is not far from the intentions of the Mendozas at the time, can be both compared and contrasted with a slightly later new castle further north at Coca. Architecturally, an outstanding representative of the peculiarly Spanish mudéjar style, which incorporates elements of Muslim architecture and attributed to the architect Ali Caro. Coca was built in brick for the Fonseca family, closely associated with the crown. Little is known for definite about the building process, except that the family was given the town in 1453, but the erection of the castle in one corner is documented from 1486, although there must have been something suitable 20 years before, when the Queen Juana was held there. While the decoration of the now restored inner castle is breathtaking, the defences are also serious. The outer circuit of walls is 70 metres square, with very strong pentagonal towers and a talus 10 metres high. The depth of the immense ditch shields half of the interior from hostile artillery and faces any attacker getting that far with a barrier 20 metres high. The loops and embrasures leave no dead ground and accommodate large and smaller weapons. The ditch is also protected from caponiers. Galleries and posterns enable communications throughout and active defence as well. Coca was extraordinarily sophisticated. Not far away, the unified monarchy of Isabel of Castile and her husband Ferdinand of Aragon, who took the throne in 1474, ordered the construction of an even more sophisticated fortress at La Mota in Medina del Campo. Sadly, I haven't yet been able to visit it. Ferdinand and Isabella oversaw a progressive development of castle building, combining fortress with palace, from the new conquered lands of Granada in the south to their northern frontiers with their French competitors. Conquering Granada meant ruling over deeply resentful populations who did, indeed, meet their conquerors' expectations by rebelling. A new Castillo was built inside the historic Alcazaba of Almeria, which had yielded without a fight in 1489. The interior had been destroyed by an earthquake. The conquerors built a new citadel, spending enormous sums of money between 1490 and 94, completing it in a second phase from 1499, evidently combining statement architecture with modern defensibility. And they did the same in Malaga, Carmona, Granada, and elsewhere. There was also here originally a ditch. Beyond the Pyrenees, their new fort of Salses, French Sals, begun in 1497, was both a new level of defensive planning and a definitive separation between noble residence and garrison fortress. These Iberian examples confirm that it was both possible and practical, but also very expensive, to combine the requirements of late medieval monarchs and wealthy nobles for splendour, comfort, and security, and remind us that the contemporary reality can offer clues to their intentions. But sometimes, even with context and strong documentary evidence, it can be very hard to reach a safe conclusion. My final example from across the channel is a case study of an exotic and surely purely symbolic fortress. Bonneguy in southwest France has long provoked debate. The late Michel Coste and Professor Faucher proposed in 2018 a new dating sequence based on family history and study of the owner's finances. The work was completed by 1519. The long-lived builder, Béranger de Roquefort, third son of a noble father, probably spent his early childhood serving with Louis XI's artillery before inheriting his patrimony in 1482. He moved to Bonneguy in 1505, a start date for the building around an existing ruined castrum. The new works reflect the defensive ideas of the late 15th century. A deep ditch, a fausse bray, a caponnier to protect the ditch, and an immense boulevard. There are numerous drawbridges. Gun loops peer from every side. Even at first sight, it looks completely over the top. And Coste's and Faucher's conclusion is that he was piling up features of modern defences with no practical purpose, but an intent to impress. The chapel is dedicated to St. Barbara, patron saint of gunners. But they ask, I quote, "Why such an affirmation of modernity in warfare, but none in the ways of the Renaissance of the arts, such as was pursued by his near neighbours?" These experts have no answer. My argument today is based on the view that in the mind of a medieval noble or ruler, the symbolism and the reality of both projecting and protecting their power may have included the option of doing both. Their worldview recognized that sometimes they needed to defend their position in society. Now, that isn't at all to suggest that when they commissioned a residence with only the trappings of artillery defense, they weren't saying that the defensive aspects of the resulting castle were always intended as symbols. But considering the contemporary context can help distinguish when being defensible also mattered. Therefore, I end with the ultimate example for UK audiences of the symbolic late medieval castle. You were waiting for this. Bodiam is the chief embodiment of what I have dared to suggest may sometimes be a false debate between symbolism and defence. All will know the case best presented by the late Charles Colson. Let me point out some contextual facts. Sir Edward Dallingridge was not a retired veteran investing his wartime plunder in a magnificent retirement home. When he built the castle in 1385, he was still serving the king, at that moment supervising building the defences of Rye. He had been seriously wounded during a French raid in 1380. His military career continued until 1390. Bodiam has been compared with the castle of Derval in Loire-Atlantique in France, held by his fellow English captain Robert Knowles, which resisted a French siege for 6 months in 1373-4. Now, I doubt Dallingridge believed a necessarily fast-moving French raiding party would hang around while they worked out how to drain Bodiam's lake, or that they might not be deterred by the gun loops, while the castle sheltered his own wealth and family and that of his tenants. Deterrence and display need not be counterposed. The Battle of Bodiam has lasted even longer than the 100 Years' War. Perhaps it's time to end it by meeting in no man's land and agreeing perhaps a new set of parameters, or if you prefer, a compromise. Sadly, I'm not optimistic. Thank you very much.